Now, Ms. Rankin?
Yes. Apologies for the slightly late start.
Good afternoon,
Good afternoon.
Ms. Rankin. You have, of course, given evidence before in nearly a year ago, if
Yes, almost a year.
I recollect, in September of last year. Now, understand that you're prepared to take the oath.
I am.
Sitting where you are, could I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the
Thank you
truth.
very much, Ms. Rankin. Now, you have previously seen the way that we conduct proceedings. I don't know how long your evidence is going to be this afternoon, but if at any stage you want to take a break, just give me an indication. Now, Mr. Connell.
Right, Lord. Ms. Rankin, I'm going to use your response to question. I was about to call it a witness statement, but it's in the form of a response to a questionnaire from time to time as a sort of guide to where we've got to in the questions I'd like to take from you. And I'm going to take some of the material in there from you in some detail. Can I ask you, first of all, the formal question, which is, are you content to adopt your answers in that questionnaire as part of your oral evidence?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Now, as you'll have gathered, we've been asking some people who were in York Hill or had experience of York Hill, to be precise, to assist with their impressions on a number of issues, and you fall into that category. Just to give the background to that for the purpose of the oral evidence, I'd just like to start at the beginning of your answers, where you explain the way in which you connected to York Hill, if I can use that as a neutral term. Because in 2006, you say you became the head of nursing for infection control acute sector at the board, and York Hill was one of the areas within that. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, you describe it as a strategic role with no direct operational IPC responsibility. Does that mean you knew what was going on or you didn't?
So I wasn't operational at a hospital site level. I would have had oversight of issues. I wouldn't have had oversight of a day-to-day routine, but oversight of issues. So I would like to think I knew what was going on, but I was very reliant on the teams, and there was a number of teams across the different sites.
Sure. No doubt, if they're reporting to you, you're largely reliant on the quality of the reports that you get. But assuming these are accurate, what you say here is that you met weekly with the lead infection prevention control nurses. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you say you were updated about any significant issues or outbreaks or IMTs that they had.
Yeah, so there was a variety of ways in which we were updated. But to take you back, the teams worked on a hospital site, but the Greater Glasgow and Clyde at that point worked on a directorate basis.
Right.
So to provide meaningful information to your general managers, your directors, we looked at pulling together directorate reports. So although there were directorate reports that were informed by the hospital level information, at the lead nurse meeting, we didn't go into detail of every single issue, but if the lead nurses brought any challenges, if they were seeing an increase of a certain thing, or if they had an ongoing issue, then it was around informing, but also peer support from the other lead nurses.
You then go on to explain in the next paragraph that you reconfigured the structure to align with the directorate.
Yeah, I've jumped ahead.
And you say this widened the remit of the lead infection prevention control nurses. Can you just explain what the point here is?
So if I use perhaps York Hill as an example, the lead nurse would have covered York Hill. We widened it to a directorate response, so it was women and children's. So they had oversight of the maternity units, which was the women on the other sites. Like what would have been the Southern General site, the Glasgow Royal. So it was a women and children's directorate. So although we had an infection control team on site at York Hill, the lead had a wider remit for women and children's.
Right. So their jurisdiction, as it were, was expanded to include other areas.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you go on to explain that you established directorate reports, and you set out in some detail what these were. Now, we're jumping ahead a little bit as it happens, but I'll do it because that's the way you've approached it in your answer. On the second page of your witness statement, that's page 114 of the electronic version, still in answer 1, you say any unusual organisms reported to IPCT at York Hill, Chehallion, would have been included within these reports. So that's your position.
Yes.
Other people have been asked a similar question. You go on to say, to be asked in effect, do you remember any unusual organisms being reported from York Hill?
I don't.
And then you go on to back that up, I think, by mentioning specific organisms that you'd never come across until you came across them in the new hospital. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
I have them listed here, and I'll get the pronunciation probably incorrect. Cupravidis, Achromobacter buckholderi. Near
Burkholderia, but yeah.
Okay.
Can you give me the second one again?
Achromobacter.
Thank you.
So these are the three you've listed.
Yeah, these were examples of unusual. I could probably have given, there's Elizabeth Kingia, there are other ones that I hadn't dealt with, certainly as part of these directorate reports, and I hadn't dealt with prior to this.
Right. And you go on to say that nothing had been reported on these. And you mention other meetings, such as the AICC and the BICC, both of which we've heard about. Were you involved in these committees?
Yes, I was. So at the at the Acute Infection Control Committee, we would drill down into the hospital level if there was any issues. The lead nurses also attended and they would give an update. My recollection is not only the lead nurses would attend, but the infection control doctors were part of that. And there was an agenda for each site. I can't remember if it was done in directorate level or hospital level, but they definitely had an opportunity, and that was where if there was any outbreaks or any issues, that would be reported in. And then the higher level, the Acute Infection Control Committee fed into the Board Infection Control Committee.
So you hadn't come across them, and you're pretty sure they weren't referred to any of these committees?
I don't recall them ever being discussed.
Now, you're then in a different position, because in 2009 you then leave the board anyway to join HPS, which is now RHI, and then you sort of come back at this in a way in 2017, is that correct? Yeah,
2017, but mainly 2018. I did provide some support in 2017 with the Stenotrophomonas issue, but it wasn't myself, that was the nurse consultant from HPS involved. I think it was just covering during leave, but 2018 it was myself that represented HPS.
Yep. You, as you know, I think we've been looking at epidemiological charts and so on, and I'm going to ask you to look at one or two of these just to see if you have any comments that might assist the inquiry. But you make the point in answer to question 2 that you're not an epidemiologist. specifically, but you did touch on that when you were doing a master's degree,
Yeah.
is that right?
So an infection control qualification covers epidemiology to help you, for an assessment for an outbreak around time, place, person, etc. So yeah, I would say every infection control nurse has epidemiology training to a degree.
The reason you've asked the question essentially in question 2 is, do you accept there were a higher number of environmentally based bacteremia cases in York Hill compared to the new hospital? And you say, well, subject to the qualifications, I'm not an epidemiologist. You basically say, no, you don't accept that.
Well,
So it doesn't match what you knew.
Doesn't match what I knew.
So unless somebody was ignoring significant environmentally sourced infections and not telling you and not discussing it in your meetings or going on to the other meetings, you weren't aware of anything in York Hill.
No. And perhaps I'm jumping on too much, but in 2018, when we were seeing a lot of the unusual ones, no one ever said, we've seen this before. In fact, quite the opposite. The clinical team, in particular, who springs to mind, Professor Gibson and Dr. Murphy, both were very concerned that they hadn't seen some of these infections before, or even an individual with numerous bacteria. The infection control team, my colleague Susie Dodd, hadn't, when she took over as lead nurse, my understanding is she was seeing and feeling something slightly different or unusual. So my dealings in 2018 predominantly were at the IMT, where I, engaged with Professor Gibson and our colleagues, and also Dr. Inkster and Miss Dodd.
Now, probably my fault for not picking up. Towards the beginning of what you've just answered, you said, going forward to 2018, nobody mentioned, now what I heard was this, and my question is, what were you referring to by this?
Unusual organisms, I'm guessing.
I mean, we don't need to go back over the exact words. It's just the meaning that I'm trying to...
So in 2018, what I was hearing was the situation with the different types of organisms was unusual and clinically hadn't been experienced before.
Right.
And the clinical team remained stable throughout. So,
thank you.
Just so we make sure we get all of the points that you're making in your answer clearly, if I can, have you got your witness statement there?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm looking at electronic page 115. I'm still in answer 2. And there's a long paragraph that says that furthermore. You see that? Third paragraph on the page, in effect. You're trying to make a point there that it's not just numbers that matter.
Yeah.
So what's your point, just so we're clear, we understand it?
So it's around clinical cases, and it's around looking at each individual case, looking at considering all routes of transmission. The reason it's not specific numbers is what we were seeing. If you take each organism, we were perhaps seeing a low level of some of the organisms because they were very unusual. And if you just take a numbers game, you could say, well, we've only had one of that. What's the significance? But the significance of that in comparison, you need to take it with the clinical presentation as well as the potential source, as well as comparing with all the other, perhaps 1, 2 numbers. So rather than taking each organism as a number, there's a bit more. And certainly at the IMT, these were discussed in great detail, each case, as they come through. The clinicians gave their background, and there was always a discussion as to whether it would be included as a case, because you had a case definition. So it wasn't just a case of, well, we've got another 2 positives. At the IMT, you would go through the 2 positives to see whether they fitted a case definition, were they a previous positive. So it's not quite, from my perspective, as straightforward as numbers.
What you go on to say is the cases presented in the data and those identified from 2015 onwards in the new hospital are not comparable, as many of the cases identified have been unusual organisms, which is the point you've made already, not previously reported in this clinical cohort. That's the point you made about the consistency of the clinicians. Now, if just pausing there, was the appearance of a number of different unusual organisms a matter of concern?
Absolutely.
And why was that?
Because they all had, if they were gram-negative predominantly, that were being reported in, and in the background, very early on, when we looked at the water system, was because we were seeing, perhaps if I take you back to when we first got the call around, or the reporting in of the Cupriavidis in 2018, whilst we'd had one reported in 2016, I wasn't involved in that. The 17 I don't think came to us, and then the 2018 case, it was my colleague that took the call from Dr. Inkster, and she called me, and I can remember the call, and we were like, all right, okay, what is that? Let's have a good look and see what the source is. So it's not something that had been reported in. And then from there on, there was a number of other unusual ones, but
The other point that you make there, and I just want to, again, to make sure I have your evidence in a way that we can't always get it off the page precisely. You say many samples had been polyclonal, which would be suggestive of an environmental source. Now, why do you say that?
Because normally if you have person-to-person spread, it's unusual to have multiple organisms spread. So it tends to be an environmental source. And therefore, if you take the water as an example, if the infection route is via the water and the water is contaminated with multi-organisms, then the contamination is occurring at that time. If it's not an environmental source, if it's a person-to-person spread, the likelihood of transferring or transmitting person-to-person or staff is incredibly unlikely. It can happen, but for it to happen for more than one child is when you would start to think it points more towards an environmental source.
So just, can I try and get my head around what you've just told me and see if I understand it? You can correct me. The reason you say that the polyclonal results suggest an environmental source is that it would be unusual for, as it were, multiple organisms to be transferred from one human source to another human source, whereas they could come from water or some other environmental source. Is that the point?
It's more about, so if it coming from a person, the person would need to have all these organisms. So for one person to have on more than one occasion something with more than one child, it was polyclonal, the chances of that are, and it didn't all happen at the one time. You would perhaps have a case and you would discuss it at the IMT, and then maybe a week later they would have repeat blood cultures done for clinical indications, and you would then get the report of that organism, and then you would realise that actually, although it's a different organism, it's in a child you already know. And the point being that at the IMT we did discuss every single case in great detail, and the importance of the clinical team from that perspective was huge. And that's why when you're listening to your clinical team telling you this is unusual, this doesn't feel like something we've had before, then you have to pick up on that.
you. But in fact, in the next paragraph of your answer, you set out material that you've actually just told us about the team remaining the same, not having seen these before. And then you end that answer by dealing with, as it were, the position of you and your colleagues in HPS. And you said you hadn't seen them before either.
No, I hadn't seen.
And you
I mean,
say,
the 2018 report of Cuprievadis was the first one I'd ever, but there was a number we had never had reported in.
yeah, can I just check, when you say that, in that sentence, the one that starts from an IPC perspective, the types of organisms and polyclonal episodes were those that neither I nor my colleagues within HPS had seen or reported before. Is that from anywhere, or is that just from York Hill?
No, that's from anywhere.
Right.
Sorry, that's from
Anywhere. They had, from a national perspective, we hadn't had those reported in to us before.
Right, so this is not specific to the York Hill new hospital issue.
No,
it's just
from anywhere. Yeah, because as a consultant working from our high now at HPS, you go along to an IMT and you provide national support. Often you come back and you discuss with your colleagues and, am I missing anything or what do you... So there was a lot of discussion around this. So that's why I can say with a degree of confidence that none of my colleagues had experienced this before.
Could I just clarify this? When you speak about a polyclonal episode, polyclonal, as I understand it, many a clone is a family of microorganisms, I assume.
Yeah.
When you talk about a polyclonal episode, is that in one patient exhibiting infection from a number of microorganisms?
Yeah.
And if I can go back to the logic, and if you are considering the probability of the source of such an infection of an individual, you've told us that it seems more probable that these multi-sources will come from, for example, the water system, as opposed to another patient. Now, it has been put to us that possibly more infections arise from the patient's own microbiome than from the environment. Now, does your observation about likelihood of the source being environmental take into account the consideration that possibly a more common source is not infection from another human being, but from the patient's own gut, as I think it was put?
So that's the importance of when you have an IMT and you look at each case, is going through each case, because each one would have been considered and the clinical input was important there. The other thing, though, is this was what we felt unusual from a national perspective, but also being reported from the team as unusual. I'm not sure I would understand why, when nothing had really changed, that we would be seeing what we were seeing over that period of time, why we hadn't experienced that before, because I don't believe treatments had changed that much and the population was relatively stable. Why, if it was an endogenous source, why this was happening at this particular time, in addition to positive water results. But we didn't, at the IMT, we didn't just assume each case was an environmental case. Each case, there's a lot of talk about root cause analysis and all sorts. a good IMT, when you discuss your case, you're almost doing a mini root cause analysis because you're going through each case and you're exploring whatever hypothesis. And sometimes when you have 3 or 4 new cases, and that can be quite challenging, but that was what happened. And whichever clinician was there, they would feed in, or sometimes it was the nursing staff. Emma Somerville or Angela Howitt were very good at, feeding back on clinical.
Thank you.
And just to finish that section, I've just asked you about your last answer. That's part of answer 2. Does that answer also cover gram-positives such as Mycobacterium shaloni, which we've had to touch on several occasions in this inquiry? Or is this all gram-negatives you're talking about?
At this time, it was gram-negatives.
And does that mean you came across Mycobacterium shaloni on a different occasion?
No. So over the 2018, my recollection was there was 2 Chaloni reported in. One, I think, was around May 18, and then one in 19. At the time of the report in 2018, I hope I've got the dates correct. At the time of 18, it was unusual, but it wasn't something we saw, and perhaps, and this is where we didn't jump to the environment for every case, perhaps there could have been other reasons. And my recollection is the water wasn't tested at that time for Chaloni. So it was gram-negatives.
Gram-negative. Thank you. Now, the next question you asked is about the proposition that there was a 2-fold decrease in environmentally relevant organisms between York Hill and the new hospital. And your response we can find on page 116. So let's see at the top. And your first response is simply to say, no, I don't agree. That's your position, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And you say at the end of that paragraph, it doesn't align with your experience working in the board or in HPS.
Yeah.
What you then go on to point out is that there was a decline initially, and then that changed, particularly in 2017.
Yeah. So this is me looking at, I think I was asked to look at a chart, and that was the 2-fold decrease. We didn't have anything reported in. My experience of York Hill, there wasn't unusual organisms, and there was nothing reported into HPS. So from that point of view, if I don't look at charts, would I have said there was a decrease? There was certainly not a decrease in what was reported to us at that time.
So for whatever the position is, York Hill, nothing of worry is reported. Start to get into 2017, issues of concern are being reported in new hospital. Is that the distinction?
Yeah, I do. I mean, reflecting back and looking back at as much notes as I was able, the only thing of significance from York Hill through my time there was an one-off incident in their paediatric intensive care related to Pseudomonas, which happens from time to time in intensive care settings, but that's only, none of the unusual organisms at all.
We move in question 4 into a slightly different question, which has cropped up in a variety of formats, but it's essentially about comparing adult hemato-oncology patients with child hemato-oncology patients. And different witnesses have given us slightly different explanations on this, so I'd like to get yours I mean, first of all, the general idea of comparing one to the other, do you think that's a valid thing to do?
Not particularly. I think even treatments are different from adults and the level of immunosuppression. And bear in mind, I'm not a hemato-oncologist, nor do I profess to have any of their knowledge. But the level of immunosuppression varies, I suppose, depending on the age, their immunity, their immune system, and even just children being children. Whilst they are all in single rooms, they are much more mobile about, and I don't believe it's fair to compare.
Thank you. I think the other thing you mentioned in your answer to that, which is on page 117, if you want to look at it, is prophylaxis regime differing?
Yeah, I believe they were. I believe that from picking up from discussions just in some of the IMTs, where that adults were more routinely given things like ciprofloxacin, antifungal, and I don't think the children got that as routinely.
In question 5, you asked about various tables. I'm going to ask you to look at some tables shortly, but you make the point in the middle of your answer there that reporting to HPS has changed over the years. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And what you're saying is you can't see anything having been reported to HPS 2005, 2015?
Nothing.
Now, can I just ask you, while we're talking about sort of processes, have the arrangement for surveillance for organisms changed over the years?
I don't know if they've changed as such. We have the National Infection Prevention and Control Manual, which was first published with Chapter 1 in 2012. From an outbreak perspective, Chapter 3 was first published in 2016. But from an alert organism surveillance perspective, that's national guidance. But that's alert organism surveillance is the absolute bread and butter of an infection prevention and control nurse. And that was just, I've been in infection control for a long, long time. And we've always done the alert organisms might change, but you're always mindful of, emerging pathogens and new, but a way back there was a big focus on MRSA, but so you had surveillance systems in place. Otherwise, how would you know what was going on in your area, what was going on in your wards, what was, a reflection of infection control practices? So, but the national response has emerged for over the years. Way back in 2000, maybe 2002, there was Code of Practice, there was the Carey report, they all mentioned surveillance. SCIA, which became HPS before it became RHI, produced a document on a pilot of surveillance of outbreak of incidents, and this was post the Watt report, which was 2002. Around 2007, the chief executives got a letter from, I'm sure it was the Chief Nursing Officer's Directorate, detailing the procedure for reporting incidents. So in terms of reporting incidents, you obviously have to have a local surveillance process in place to identify you have an incident. But this went on. In 2009, HPS produced their first guidance on local surveillance, which was then updated in 2014. And I can say with a degree of confidence that the 2014 version, which went into great detail on local surveillance processes and procedures and gave examples of alert organisms. Now, bearing in mind, these are only examples and locally, but they did include things like Burkholderia and Stenotrophomonas. So they were first, I think, listed as around 2014. Going back a bit before that, I've missed out the bit around the Clinical Standards Board for Scotland, and I think that would have been around 2002 also, and Standard 4 was around surveillance. So whilst perhaps the national guidance in terms of Chapter 3 was only published in 2016, there's been a lot of work prior to that nationally and at government level and local. You know, every board had their local infection control manual before the national manual. So there's always been a requirement for surveillance.
I have a reference here to something called ICNet.
Yeah.
What's that?
So ICNet was an electronic system, and I am sure trialled, one of the first hospitals to trial it was in Glasgow. I worked in Glasgow, as I've mentioned, and this is a electronic system where it's tied into laboratory, and it's an alert system, so you can set triggers, etc. It's just an electronic system for reporting. In the old-fashioned days, we used to go to the laboratory every day, and you had a book, and you know the patients were within that. So I think this is what was emerging as an electronic system for reporting. But I suppose with any electronic system, a lot of times it's only as good as what you ask it to do. So I think you have to set what the alert organisms are for it to then tell you what you've got.
I'm told that one of the organisms you might want to use as an example is Serratia.
Serratia. Yeah. So yeah. I mean, if we go back, if we use Glasgow as an example, we've had Serratia outbreaks reported in their neonatal intensive care unit. I think round about, I'm testing my memory here, 2014, perhaps maybe slightly later. So there was obviously a local surveillance procedure in place to identify an incident and report it. So
there's always been some kind of mechanism for reporting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I worked in Glasgow, there was definitely, and if we go back to the directorate reports that I mentioned earlier, then they were populated with the local team giving you the data on alert organisms. And I'm sure also at the time we started a data team, and I think they did an electronic database, an alert organism database. I'd need to just double check exactly what that was called in the details, but so the alert organisms were reported into our data team, and they held that. This was the ones that the ICT knew or were reporting, not a lab-based one.
I'm going to take you to something called a situational assessment that you had at least some involvement with shortly. I'd just like, since we have you here, and you've expressed some views on these matters based on your experience, to ask you to have a look at some charts. So if we go first of all to something we've looked at already, which is what we are calling the HAD2 report, which is a response to reviews of HAD1 by the authors, Professor Hockey, Dr. Drumright and Dr. Agrawal, which is in Bundle 44, Volume 5, at page 50. So this is therefore a slightly later document than the original HAD report. Now, you've explained your involvement both originally at NHS, GDC, and subsequently at R high. This graph that appears on page 51 of the bundle, I think it's 50 of the bundle, 31 of the document, appears to show, at least to a lay reader, a graphical indication of an increase in infections starting to go up sometime in 2016 and then going up to a peak somewhere around 2018 before dropping off again. Can you help us at all as to whether that accords with the information that you were getting?
Yeah, the rise in so from clinically, the rise in 2008 or upwards from 2016, and then the decline from 2020 onwards fits with the 2018, 19 and the previous reported 2017 instance. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't comment on the difference in lines, linear and smooth and GAM fit. I'm not, from an epidemiology point of view, that's out with my remit of understanding. But looking at this from a clinical perspective, then that rise in the chart absolutely fits with what we were supporting Glasgow with.
Right. So if the proposition is that the pink, it's not quite a line, it's a bit broader than a line, but if that represents, to begin with, a declining rate of bloodstream infections during the time that the Schiehallion unit is in York Hill, and then from about 2016, when the Schiehallion unit is in the Royal Hospital for Children, that rate rises until a date, maybe sometime in 2018, and then falls away and continues to fall away to 2022, assuming that that is what the representation is, that would accord with your understanding.
Yeah, so I'm reading that as the dip. If the children moved in 2015, then there's a dip, and then it starts to rise from 2016, more mid 2016, right through. Yeah, that's what that says to me.
Mr. Cohn?
Well, can I ask you to look at one other document while we're doing this exercise, if you wouldn't mind, which is in Bundle 44, Volume 7, at page 56, because there have been further discussions. Now, let's go on to 57 and 58. Now, what's been happening is that there have been exchanges involving epidemiologists to which you've not been a party, so you don't need to worry about that too much. But if you just take it from me that this is a document that's subsequently been produced following these discussions, involving in particular Mr. Mukherjee and Dr. Trumright, and this particular graph that we're looking at on page, which one that was, 50, is that 58? Yep. Yeah, it's 58. Just deals with a period from 2015 to somewhere in 2019, falls off the other end. Now, that appears to show, if to a lay person, that there's an increasing event happening. Would that match your understanding?
Yeah, that's how I would view that, and that would fit with what the clinical presentation was. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll just check 59 while we're here. No, not worry about that. And 60. Right. So I'm just really looking at that, sticking to the one graph that matches your understanding. Now, what I was going to ask you to do now was to go to something that your organisation was involved in, which is something called a situational assessment. Now, first of all, what's a situational assessment anyway?
We often do a situational assessment when the framework's been invoked, which in this case it was, and it was the Scottish Government that invoked the framework, where we are then asked to provide support, albeit we were, but produce an update. So quite often we produce situational assessments, which really is, as it says, it's just assessing the situation as we see it at the time and reflecting on what we've found.
Right. Well, I'd like you to look at bundle 7, page 205. Now, what we'll find when we look through this document is a narrative section and then an appendix with some charts at the back. Can you help us understand, given we've got you here, so you can't get away while I ask you the question. How would your organisation go about creating a document like this?
So my recollection of this, we'd done a couple of reports beforehand, which summarised what we were dealing with at the time. This one, I think, is the one, that was written in December 18, but actually published in June 19. Yeah, that's correct. Where we, in addition to our epidemiology and data team looking at figures and data, we did a review of the ward, and one of my colleagues did several walk rounds of the ward, so that we weren't just focusing on an environmental. Was there any other issues that we found? And sorry, I've completely forgotten what you asked me.
I'm just, so that if His Lordship looks at this document, he has in his head, what it was and how it was prepared. I think you were explaining that you weren't just looking at figures, but you actually arranged, some colleagues visited the ward. Is that right?
So it was my colleague Hayley Kane who did a walk round and met with several of the staff. She actually did it, I think, on 3 occasions. She went back to the ward and interacted with staff, had a look. So she was looking at a whole variety of things, looking at any practice that she observed, any hand hygiene practice, was the environment clean? And my recollection is that she felt that practice was very good. There was, I think, as I recall, I can't remember if she actually witnessed some condensate from chilled beams or whether that had been reported to her. I'd need to just go back and double check that. But so it was a wider than just look at data. It was, let's look at the whole to see the whole environment that the children were in, to see if there was anything else.
And what this appendix does is it sets out what it's trying to do, it sets out the definitions, it sets out what, sorry, in my layman's term, bugs you were looking for.
Yeah.
So if we go on to 206, just so we can see how it's done, there's non-environmental species, analytical methods explained. Go on to 7, and that's tabular result, and then what we then find is a series of charts. Is that right?
Yeah.
What was the idea in producing these charts? What were you trying to achieve, your organisation?
The chart on page 2007, is it?
Yeah, let's move on to 208.
Yeah.
And I think there's some that follow, but just if we pause on page 208 so we can understand what it was that you were trying to do.
So this would be done by the data team, and my recollection is that they looked in an electronic system called ECOS and pulled out the blood cultures within the patient group of 2A, 2B, and then a comparator for all other areas in RHC, with a list of environmental, I don't think it was gram negatives, I think it was environmental organisms that had been identified or from within the water samples. I think they had positive. I'm sure it says, but the bit before that, what the criteria was.
What's the significance of the upper warning limit, UWL?
So that this is a statistical process charts gives you where you are breaching and where you should be concerned, if you like, from an upper warning line. And there are a lot of limitations with statistical process charts, and perhaps I would be looking at the variation rather than the warning line. And the reason for, if you have a higher background rate or a higher number, then your warning line can be pushed up and you might not breach it so readily.
So there are two things. That there's the upper warning limit and the upper control limit.
Yeah.
So can you help us as to what the point of these lines is?
I would rather defer to, we can look at an SPC, but I don't know if I would be able to give you. My colleague Shona tomorrow might help you with an SPC, although it was our data team that did this chart.
Right. So the RHE, there's the 2AB group. So that's we'll call it Schehalian for the moment. And then there's the other group. Are they intended to be looking for the charts to be displaying the same things? Because the other group chart just bobbles along the bottom of the page. It's not showing this kind of movement at all.
Because there's not the kind of variation, etc. So therefore it's a relatively flat line. And I mean, if you just glance at it from a layman perspective, the activity is 2A, 2B rather than everywhere else.
Yeah. And with the limitations that you've explained, if you look at 2014, that's you still in York Hill for that cohort. You've got some variations.
Yeah.
I think I've been told that the mean line is the York Hill line, but it doesn't matter for present purposes. In any event, there's a drop off between 2015, 2016, and then it starts basically to go up again with spikes.
Yeah.
Can we just look at the next page, please, just in case it helps us? Now, this is gram-positive blood cultures. Again, in comparison with the non-2A group, as it were, which is the relatively quiet line, if I can call it that, down below. Again, we see a rise, 2014, up and down a bit, 2015, then up in 2016, and some other ones as well.
Yeah. So gram-positive can be very indicative of practice, and I know that there was a lot of work done on central line associated bloodstream infections, which brought the rates down, a very separate piece of work, but led by one of their chief nurses and a clinician, and did a lot of work around central line associated bloodstream infections to drive.
CLABSI?
Yeah, CLABSI.
Where there was a target. So there was a rate that was regarded as not good enough, and I'm forgetting the rate, and that's my fault. And then a lot of work put into it, and it ended up with a rate which was, if not world beating, certainly heading that way. Is that right?
Yep, that's my understanding.
Yeah. Thank you. The way these charts have been put together, I know you're not the principal author of these charts. The approach seems to have been to start, if I'm picking this up correctly, about the start of 2014, and then run through to, where you'd reached at the time, which was the end of 2018, albeit the report wasn't published until June of the next year. Is there any suggestion you should have gone back further beyond 2014 into the earlier history of York Hill?
I suppose, and I'm going to go back to the clinical point of view, we were being told that this was unusual, this was different, that even had we gone back, I suppose it's around, we were dealing at the time with an incident, and what had happened before, perhaps to look back at some point, but at that particular time you wanted to know how did that compare, probably more recently, but I keep going back to it felt differently, it looked differently, and the clinical staff were expressing we hadn't seen this before.
Thank you. Well, let's leave that bunch of charts. Thank you. Let me ask you a broader question. One of the issues that the inquiry has been asked to look at is basically, are things okay now? And that's a very colloquial way of describing one of the inquiry's terms of reference, but that's the essence of it. And to some extent, that you look at that in your response to question 9, where you asked if you have anything else to add on page 119 of your questionnaire response. You say, since the refurbishment of 2A and B and the repatriation of patients to the ward, there has been a significant reduction in the number of gram-negative organism-associated incidents reported to RHI Scotland. So assuming they're reporting it properly, this looks positive news, is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I don't, there was one incident reported in that I'm aware of from 2A, but since then I'm not aware of, from a gram-negative perspective, it's significantly reduced.
Thank you. Well, let me go on to one or two other topics,
Okay.
if I may, slightly off the slope we've been on, or the rise we've been on, depending on interpretation. Can I ask you to look at a minute of a meeting in 2009? Now we're stretching back. And I think you may have been asked about this before, but our level of knowledge has changed. We're looking at bundle 23, page 46. Now, the reason that we're asking about this now is that in the course of the evidence the inquiry has heard, it has become apparent that let me just call it the specification, for want of a better word, for isolation rooms was included in a document called the employer's requirements, which is the document that the contractor essentially follows. And we've had evidence from the designer who said, well, I go to the employer's requirements and see what it says for isolation rooms, and that's what I do. And the isolation rooms were all to be essentially PPVL rooms, and there's some debate around the edges, but that's the essence of it. Now, this appears to be a meeting that you were present at in 2009 when, to cut to the chase, there was discussion about various types of isolation rooms which might be suitable in different locations for different purposes. Is that fair?
Yeah.
And I suppose that the question really is that here you have a reasonable number of people, all with a variety of qualifications, including, as it happens, one of the assistant project managers from the project, Heather Griffin, discussing possibility of a whole range of different isolation rooms. But can you help us at all as to what happened after that? Because you have a sort of mismatch. The employer's requirements say PPVL rooms. Here you have a meeting only a matter of a month or so afterwards saying, oh, range of rooms. Can you help us at all as to what was done after that to make sure that those concerned, whether it's contractors or project team or whatever, knew that a position had been agreed on isolation rooms?
I don't think I'm going to be able to help you much with this because I don't recall this meeting. I'm not disputing I was there. I don't recall it. I don't recall seeing those notes, or it would be helpful if there was any email that was associated with the notes that was sent. I do note that the paper, the notes refer to a paper produced by myself, Drs Reading and Dr Hood. And that's why I struggle as to why I don't remember this meeting, because I did not produce a paper with Drs Reading or Dr Hood. And the reason I can categorically say that is I worked very closely with Dr Reading when we worked at the Victoria Infirmary. And I would recall if we produced a paper as far back as then, but I had never worked with Dr Hood. Up until we did the work in the short life working group for Cryptococcus, whilst I knew who Dr Hood was and had perhaps spoken to him, to produce a paper would require some interaction and some degree of working, and I have never worked directly with Dr Hood. So I'm not understanding the purpose of this meeting to discuss a paper. And prior to the inquiry bundles, I had never seen this paper before, the notes. So
because
I don't know how helpful.
Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
No.
The note is simply a note of the meeting. I don't think we have the paper, but we only have the notes of the meeting.
Yeah, but the meeting was to discuss a paper that I did not author, and don't ever recall. I had conversations, and there were conversations. There were nothing formal with Dr Reading before, because we obviously worked at the Victoria, and the Victoria had been at a new building, and we worked together on that. And Dr Reading was of the view of the isolation rooms being in a stack at the side of the ward, but that was conversations. There was nothing put down in paper. There was nothing discussing whether they were PPVL rooms or ventilated rooms or anything like that. I also noticed that, so if we go to the first one, it's isolation rooms for the New South Glasgow Hospital are as follows: hemato-oncology. And it talks about a sealed ward. So it doesn't talk about isolation rooms. It talks about a ward. So the paper, without any context, I don't know if I could give any more to it other than I can only tell you what I'm reading on a piece of paper.
Were you involved in any of the discussions later in 2009 with contractors who were bidding for the project thing called competitive dialogue?
I was.
Do you remember any discussions about isolation rooms?
I don't.
Thank you anyway.
I mean, if there is I noticed from Ms Devine's latest supplementary statement, she says she recalls this meeting, so I do not recall the meeting or the paper.
No, the question is not so much directed at anybody being at fault for anything. It's more just a question of saying, well, here we had a team got together, appear to have discussed a whole lot of things in some detail, and come to a view, and then we don't know what happened after that. Thank you for your help in any event. Can I ask you about another oddity, if I may? You were asked in question 7 about the appearance of your name on a high scribe or HI scribe.
Yeah.
document, which you seem to be given the credit for or blamed for, depending on your view, a document, but you say you weren't involved. Is that right?
No, I wasn't.
So
So I think my name's down on 2 separate documents, or it's down twice.
right.
From what I've seen from the bundles, and I was never asked to do a scribe. I was never part of because I wouldn't undertake you wouldn't undertake a scribe on your own. It's part of a team. So no, I did not do any scribe at all for the new hospital.
And you say in your answer that no one's ever really approached you about
I have never done it actually. So prior to coming to HPS, I had my operational remit was a strategic remit, so I didn't have an operational remit. So at that point, HI Scribe was relatively new. My recollection is it was 2007 came out about. So boards would be getting used to doing HI Scribes for projects, but I have never undertaken any HI Scribe, so I can say with absolute conviction I did not do an HI Scribe for the new hospital.
do you now have a knowledge of?
I have a knowledge of it. I've never actually done one or taken part, so I have a knowledge of it. And the stage 1 scribe would it covers things like the positioning of the hospital in terms of the risk to the existing hospital, the environment roundabout. So I know there's been a lot of talk around sewage, been close to sewage works. That would have all been discussed as part of stage 1, but prior to the site location being agreed. Otherwise, if you've agreed the site location, why would you then look at risks? So that should all have been undertaken then. But my name on these 2 documents should not be there.
The one question I've been asked to raise with you, given that you're an R-high person and you're here, is the use of this scribe as a means of identifying IPC risk. I don't mean this one, but the use of it generally. Is it still a good system?
Yeah, it's evolved, it's changed, and yes, it is. It's one that's in place, and it does help guide. And what is very good is that it's a multidisciplinary approach, and it's not left to IPC. And you can have a discussion.
So when you say it's a multidisciplinary approach, not left to IPC, who else would be involved?
So you would have your facilities team predominantly. So your facilities and IPC, you might have your clinical team at some stage.
Have you any view as to whether the way the scribes were dealt with at the hospital was a problem?
No, I had no involvement. No one had spoken to me about a scribe. So
But your position is, in principle, it's quite a good system.
Yeah.
I mean, its purpose is to identify risks and ask the question, have they been considered?
Yes.
You say it has evolved. I'm open to correction. But as you say,
it's changed
underlying document is the 2007 document, which is HBN 30 or?
It's SHFN 30.
I should know this, but I'll
should
check.
know it too.
But the 2007 document has not been replaced, I don't think.
I'm sure it's been updated.
Okay, right.
The other question I've been asked to put to you, I think, is more about phraseology and risk. And if you can't help me with this, then please just say, because I've been asked to raise this with you. If you're designing something in a hospital and you're thinking about risk, particularly IPC risk, my question is around whether there's a difference between saying, oh, there's a risk of not complying with guidance number such and such, and saying there's a risk of not having the protective environment that will keep ill people safe from disease. That's a very general point, but you see the distinction I'm making between people getting together and saying, oh, there might be a risk of not complying with guidance, and people getting together and saying there might be a risk of creating an environment which isn't going to save people from, or protect people potentially from illness. Do you have any view as to whether that type of debate should go in one particular direction or another?
I'm not entirely sure what you're asking me, but so stop me if I'm going wrong. So I think what you're asking me is if there's an IPC risk identified versus perhaps a corporate risk, or no.
I think what I'm trying to get at is there a question of how you identify what the risk is? Is it a risk of not complying with guidance note, something or other, paragraph, something or other? Or is it a risk which should properly be described by looking at the potential consequence of not complying with that guidance? So if you don't, for instance, have a protective ventilation environment, you may be not complying with some paragraph of SHTMO 301, but you may also be creating an environment which potentially creates a risk to the health of the patients who are going to be in that ward.
If you're not compliant with guidance?
Yes.
So if you're not compliant with guidance, you can do what's called a derogation. But to do a derogation, there should be certainly a discussion with IPC, amongst perhaps others, around. So one of the key things is what is the derogation and what the associated risks, but predominantly what is the area. So is it a high risk area? Is it a low risk? Because you can derogate and perhaps put some other remedial measures in, therefore the risk isn't great. But if you're derogating in a high risk area with vulnerable patients, then the discussion has to be had, and IPC need to give their view.
Before maybe mine, Mr. Connell, I'm not quite sure what you're putting to the witness here.
What I'm trying to get at.
If you just pause for a moment.
Sorry.
We started with the H scribe.
Yep, well, we'll move on from H scribe.
And having thought about it, Ms. Rankin is absolutely correct. The 2007 structure, I think, has been revised. But what we still have is a list of, quite a long list of specific questions. Now, are you contrasting that as a technique, or have I got lost?
No, I'm not looking at the scribe process at all.
Right, okay. So
I've moved on from that to a more general question,
right,
which is, I mean, I could describe it in the context of writing something in a risk register. Do you write down, X happens, risk, possible non-compliance with SHTMO 301 paragraph, something or other? Or do you write down event, risk, possible health risk to seriously ill patients in ward X? I think what the inference is that there may be a tendency for people to look at risks as being risks of not complying with some point of guidance, as opposed to a risk of the consequence that may flow from that, which then may therefore divert you from thinking about the consequences. Maybe it can.
But surely, if you're looking at the risk of not complying, you automatically have to consider the consequence of that risk to be able to do a proper risk assessment.
Well, that's the question that I have. You would agree that you need to identify the consequences.
Absolutely.
Of the failure to comply with whatever it is you're looking at, guidance or whatever.
How else would you quantify that risk? Because not everything is the same risk. So you would need to look at that if we don't do X, what is the impact on?
But I'm content with that last answer, because I understand that answer. And that, for the moment at least, is my last question for this witness, my lord.
Right.
So if we could
Could I ask you to go back to your question 5 response, which is on 117 of your responses to questions? Now, the question is headed IPC practice in the Schiehallion unit. Now, you were asked a question, as I recollect, by Mr. Connell about national surveillance. And you gave quite a full answer, which I would distill as being there have been different mechanisms for national surveillance, perhaps at least since 2002.
Yeah, so it's local, so there's been national guidance towards local surveillance.
Right.
Local surveillance is key. Absolutely. So national can give an overarching picture and see, but local surveillance is key to see what's going on in that, you know, with the patient demographic, etc.
Right. And the source of guidance is now the National Infection Prevention and
Yes.
Control Manual. Now, could I just ask you to look at your final sentence under Q5 response? Having reviewed the incidents reported to HPS, no HA gram-negative bacteremia within the Schiehallion unit was reported to HPS within the time frame of 2005-2015. Can I invite you just to sort of expand on that? First of all, what did you do, and what conclusion would you invite us to draw from what you have in that sentence?
So this is in response to part C of that question, which asks about it where they reported to HPS. And we hold a database going back, and there is nothing on it around gram-negative bacteremia from Schiehallion in that time frame. So
you're responding to
part C.
Question C. You have carried out that exercise, and that's the result. Now, as you may recollect, at the end, I give an opportunity to legal representatives to suggest any further questions to Mr. Connell. So could I invite you to return to the witness room for what I hope would be no more than 10.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
Mr. Collins?
I've not been told of any further questions, Bob.
No more questions, I understand.
That's great.
That's right. Now, this is the second time you've come to give evidence, and I'm very grateful for you having done that. But you're now free to go, but with my thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now, we resume tomorrow at 10 o'clock, and then, and are you,
I'm back again, I'm afraid.
you're
Yes.
back in the morning
Yes,
and the afternoon?
the much awaited return of Mr. McIntosh takes place tomorrow morning. So after that highlight, I return in the afternoon.
Right. So we'll have Mr. McIntosh tomorrow morning and you in the afternoon.
Yes.
Right. Well, can I wish everyone a good afternoon, and we'll see each other tomorrow morning.
President.